of
Sorry.
this thing about truth and what is true, what is not true, and whether I'm lying or speaking the truth, and the trust in the channel. Sometimes most of the successful struggles we did with the paper, we published stuff that was a rumor in the company. People would get fired, wages would get late, uh, something in the conditions of work would happen. And then after we published in a paper or in Facebook where it was public for students and the management and everyone to see, and it was no longer gossip, it was like a fact. The wages did not get late. They paid on time. Or they did not fire people. Or they said we are lying. But the workers knew before before we put it on the paper that it would happen, it was true. After they knew the workers had organized themselves to denounce these things, it became not true. They took it back. So in a way, the company was trying to take the trust away from us. These people are liars. They tell stuff to try to speak ill of our bosses at the company, and it didn't happen. The wages are on time, and what it was like a game of two. And it was like who you trust that was speaking the truth? These people who are doing this, or us, your bosses? And we won because we are working. We were workers. We lived with them, and there was that. That
But you
helped.
know, yeah, but this is exactly the point. Just before Anna goes on, because there is a theory today that it's called hyperstition, which is the idea that you kind of almost magically makes things happen or not happen depending on how you frame them at the level of ideas and discourse, and you can kind of accelerate their happening or things like this. I mean, your example of, you know, circulating a rumor having an effect on it being true or not is not the circulation of rumor in itself. It's not the information, but the fact that by paying the price to tell people something that was possible, the organization was stronger. This was seen by the institution, and therefore it didn't happen. So it's a reaction to the organization, not the rumor. The rumor is a means for the organization.
Yeah, it's on the communication. It's an organizational practice.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like sometimes this is described as if communication is the thing that is changing what is true and false. And that's not it. You could have communicated and it still would like either happen or not happen, regardless of what you're saying. Only because something was tied together, right? Anticipating shows that you're risking to talk to people. Talking to people and paying a price makes people trust you and organize with you. And because you build that thing, then that thing has power to stop something, right? It's not the gossip. I mean, so it's just to spell out the whole mechanism. It is anticipatory and so on, but even so, it requires that mixture, right? Like I would still put it like it's trust versus trust and truth versus truth. It's not trust versus truth. Like it's trust in the university versus trust in the collective, right? And it's the truth of the collective. It exists more. That's what wins over the truth of the wages being cut. It's not like I trusted the rumor and because of this I made it not true. Like confidence relates to the network of confidence. I can trust more this, trust more that.
if the wages were late, the company would have to pay a price, and it decided not to. The price is higher than we made the price go up.
Exactly. Yeah, that's my impression. Like, so I just fear sometimes when the short circuit is made between trust and truth. Like, because we trusted, we made it true. No, like truth is one thing, trust is another. Well, but you can build organizations by trusting people. And now, you know, the guy looks at the organization and says, we're fucked if we make the wages late. It's like, now it's true that it's very costly. And then you don't do it, right? But you can keep both. You don't need to pretend like one thing takes off the other, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Fernanda, you asked something about fidelity.
Oh yeah, that I was curious about what Fernando was saying in the chat, but I also wanted to just say sort of briefly that so you know I've been really obsessed with this Tristan Garcia book, We Ourselves, Politics of Us, and in particular he talks about basically this exact problem in terms of prioritization of like belonging to groups of we's, right? And that I mean, in a way, when you think about truth in terms of something that isn't sort of just sort of contemplating something on a distance, but as like a practical problem, that if we take this truth as something that implies some sort of course of action, that implies, you know, participating in some sort of collective structure that engages in that action. I mean, the problem is that everyone belongs to all sorts of different group structures, right? Different sorts of we's. And I feel like a lot of what this comes down to is the prioritization structure in each individual case of like, you know, what are the most important we's. And I feel like that might be a kind of a helpful analytic approach to just look at like, you know, the ways that truth is processed based on like, you know, what I mean, even if people are like, well, yeah, like sure, like maybe this is true, but it's not as important as this other truth, in a way that can actually fundamentally change, right? Like the character of how a truth is interpreted too. You know?
Can you explain a bit more about what the proposition of the book is? Because I don't think anyone here read the Garcia book. So what does he mean by many we's?
Can you give me just 1 second? I'll come back in a little bit to talk about that more.
Yeah, because that's really interesting. I just got back here to Fernanda's question. I was thinking here if it is more interesting to frame in terms of fidelity than of trust. Fernanda, do you mean fidelity like in Badiou sense or more like religious sense?
No, in Badiou sense. I was thinking as you were talking that I agree with you that there are two different things happening: the trust cycle and the truth cycle, something like that. So, but I think that there is something in the procedure of truth and the constructive sense of the constructive collective sense that a truth is built, something like that, that requires some fidelity. That's what there reminds me of Badiou, and it's the Badiou sense of the term or his concept. I don't know. It's really hard to talk in English. Sorry.
No, you're doing it very well. Nobody could tell until you said it.
It's really hard. Anyway, so, but I think that fidelity is a nice way to approach this issue because I think there is this sort of transition. Like it's not about trust in something familiar and particular anymore. There's another step to it, so it gives us more. It gives us something more. There is something more collective to it. I don't know. I was thinking about this, but we can discuss this a little bit more. I don't know.
Yeah, but just to make it clear, like the place where you would, the phenomena you would make that comparison, where we would make that comparison, for example, is like the way these networks of like Janoni's kind of setting people to circulate news about the right or vice versa, the right, like it's in that context that we would discuss like either trust or
Yes, yeah.
fidelity, or like the science thing.
No, I was thinking about what you said about Giannoni's. I think that in the science thing there is something to it, but I think that it's more clear the fidelity thing, the fidelity step. I don't know if you can call it like that.
Yeah.
In the Giannoni's network, because it's not only a matter of trusting the information.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting question, because I mean, there is one paper which I really hated when it came out by a guy, like a media theorist, who clearly didn't read Being an Event, but he got the word fidelity and he was like, yeah, but the cool thing is corruption. So like Badiou is all about fidelity, which means like perfect information, right? Like when you say high fidelity, right? Hi-fi to a good, like, I don't know, as you were saying, Fernando, like Tidal, right? Or whatever it's called, the Jay-Z platform,
yes,
right? Like fidelity is actually hi-fi. And what we need is like corruption, because it's like creative and glitchy. And I hated it so much. But the good thing about it is that when you try to reverse engineer the critique, it's funny that Badiou chose the word fidelity, because yes, it's on the one hand like a slightly more secular version than something like faith. Faith, it's clearly like it's something transcendental. Well, you can say you have like fidelity to a person, so it's not necessarily transcendental, but it is like the core problem of the whole technical part of being an event is how can you have fidelity to something where you can never spell out what it is, because that's the whole point of it, right? So it's, if you take this information understanding of fidelity, the whole point is that there can be no hi-fi description of truths for Badiou, because truths are not a knowledge, so you cannot really, like, the whole crazy thing about it is that you can extract information about a generic subset, but you can never tell what it is totally. So it's a weird thing. So what I find interesting is that there you have like three axes there that we can play with. Like there is a trust axis, which I think has to do with belief, right? Like if I trust something, sometimes you, for example, you are okay with not knowing it. You're okay with just trusting that somebody knows something. You're okay with not knowing it yourself. Or for example, you trust information that comes from that person, so on. Then there is the axis of, verifiable information, which I think is what we usually call it by truth. Like, is it objective? Is it not, in that kind of vulgar sense of, is it a true statement or a false statement? Is it a fact or not? Can I verify it? Which is more like a vaguely describing its truth as something that correlates with the state of affairs. You can go there and check, right? And then there's a third thing, which is a weird mixture of the two, which is the concept of truth in this stronger, weird sense, where you're engaged in something which is common to everyone, but you can't really pinpoint what it is, like it's more Platonic in the sense that it helps you to understand everything else, but you can't really understand what the thing itself is so clearly, right? So it exists because it makes everything else very clear. So it proves that it's a good idea because it has many effects of making everything intelligible, but it's not itself intelligible, right? Like in Plato, the sun throws light on everything, but you cannot really look at it straight in the eye, right? So it's funny because, you can't really take that element out of science. Like, it's not just saying true things about state of affairs. Like, you make up a lot of stuff on the way, but you cannot also explain why you make up things on the way based on trust, right? So you actually need these three axes. And I feel like the interesting thing about political truth in that weird meaning that I think Badiou is trying to pinpoint, which is very subjective, right? That You can be engaged in, I mean, what Vitor said is, I think, a great example of this, right? The profound sense in which organizing the workers at a university make it true is not that he said something, a verifiable statement, but that people became more common in the organization, right? And to the point that that organization had power to get something done. In the meantime, they said some things which were true statements about the world, verifiable objectively, and they also build relations of trust, which is something slightly different. But there's a third secret thing, which is the core thing, right? And I feel like sometimes there's the tendency to try to dissolve this third thing into just a mixture of state of affairs and beliefs. Like, ultimately, you have a little machine of beliefs that you hold, which are reasonable to have, and state of affairs, which you can verify to be true. And we just update our beliefs and update our statements about the world. And that's like a more realistic description of, you know, how truth and trust interrelate, like a pragmatic kind of thing. But when you do that, you always feel like you need to mix those two things, because that more profound meaning of truth that is concerned with the idea of fidelity you mentioned, you get to see it to its effects on trust and knowledge, right? Or true statements. That's how you see it. But you can't really explain it away through those other two things, right? Like, reasonable people making true statements about the world don't organize the way that Vitor was doing at the university. So you need something else to account for something that's subjective in it. So I think that it's interesting to think about these three axes. And for example, I wonder how much of the Giannoni's effect doesn't come from the fact that it allows you to substitute fidelity for trust. You know, like, it just throws you into that process of circulating things you don't know which are true. You're supposed to be a rational leftist who doesn't circulate knowledge you're not sure of, but suddenly you're authorized to do that. It makes it feel like you're part of something, you know, as Renzo was saying, like, there's this exciting thing about it as well, but which is true, it's cool, right? But it's not the same. It doesn't substitute that other weird thing. So I don't know, there's some mixture of these things that I find interesting. And for me, that's exactly what's missing in Latour. Like, Latour thinks that you can explain the real epistemology of science simply by reintroducing the networks of trust. Like, yeah, we pretended like it was about certainty, but it was never only about certainty. It was also about confidence in these networks of alliances that we make, which is also part of the story. But you can't explain, like, scientific innovation just by, you know, encounters of sense and whatever weird delusion ontology plus building these networks of trust. Like, there's something else that's weirdly subjective about it. Not sure what you guys think of it, but I have the impression that what do you mean then is by parasocial?
Well, I just mean if it's relying on the retweeting and sharing, just spreading the word of the network, you're not really participating in the production of the truth. You're just kind of delivering truth from the trusted network to other nodes in the network. So it seems like you would suppress that axis, the third axis of, like, participating in the idea of producing it yourself. Right. So then you only have trust and the verification, right? Trust and
knowledge.
Validity. Trust
and validity. Yeah, it's good. You know, and I think that
it's like I think Letícia Cesarino talks about it. It's a you have two commands, like, if we don't do that, then if we don't share, then o comunismo vai tomar conta do país. If you don't share, and then Bolsonaro will win the election. It's the same logic in social platforms. Giannoni used it a lot. Like if you do not share this right now, then Bolsonaro will win the election and Lula will be arrested. And then again and again, and it works. No matter how many times you repeat it, it works because it is a logic of the platforms too. It is how our brains relates to
You know what I
Yeah.
just realized? Like, I'm not sure how misleading this was, but if you look at these three axes, right, we were just talking about. So validity concerns what's intelligible, right? Trust concerns like if you do things or you don't do things, exactly as Vitor just said. If you don't do this, something will happen, right? So it's like interaction. And what we're saying is like when we made the example of what Vitor was saying with the rumors about cutting wages, or when we made the example with Janones himself, when he was actually creating a network that was becoming bigger because he was touching on a real issue, right? It concerns the composition of the network. And it makes sense because in Badiou, fidelity is a problem of composition, right? And that's what's going to change the validity of new statements. So, I mean, it would work, and ultimately it brings together like, oh, cool.
Could I talk a little bit about the Garcia reference I was thinking
Sure.
before? Okay, so I think I might wait, let me try to find this. So just to like read maybe a little bit of it and then sort of talk about it. So in one place he defines a we as a complete system of divisions that cuts into the cultural and social space and even into the natural world. And then he proposes this thing called the transparency model, which he contrasts with the intersectionality model, where he talks about, so like the next sentence is like, we can then imagine the surface of everything that is, and on top of it, we can use our minds to trace a series of lines. And so it basically talks about like these, like this stacking of different we's. And like that, the higher priority ones are like a higher degree of transparent. He calls this like the transparency coefficient. And then like the further down you go, the more opaque they tend to become. So in a way, the structuring of like your sense of belonging to these different groups, which are really just sort of divisions in the world that you're forming, actually fundamentally influences the amount of intelligibility that is conditioned by the different groups that you position yourself as belonging to or participating in. Does that make sense?
Anna, I think you muted yourself.
Oh, wait, was I muted the whole time?
No. Just that we didn't let just like speak for like, no, just this last like 2 seconds.
Oh, I'm not sure what I said for the last 2 seconds. I think I might have just been asking if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that you said like, does it make sense? And then you cut off. I felt like you were. I felt like it was a tricky question. Like, did it make sense? It just threw me off.
Yeah, no, I think that's where I left off. Like, I mean, I don't know. I'm partially interested in this because I feel like there might be some degree of connection to Badiou's framework and logics of worlds, because Garcia also talks about this idea of like the extent to which something can appear within a given we. It sort of reminds me of like the like whole transcendental functor kind of thing. And it talks about the contour. It talks about in terms of contour. So I don't know. I found this all very exciting too, because he also talks about like, it's very sort of vulgarization thesis kind of thing, where he talks about we're in a situation of this ungrounding of we's, where it's like, you know, it seems like the sort of misalignment of the social terrain is connected to the fact that, and like the struggling with like intelligibility between different social groups, you know, you don't have a global sense of like the prioritization of the we's, but you have like people with completely different prioritization systems that are like all functional, but all completely misaligned with each other. And so the intelligibility and like the fidelity, composition, whatever, or even trust, right, are like, you know, misaligned largely because of the structure of like how the different we's are sort of stacked or prioritized in the kind of transparency coefficient, right? Is that like a good model? I mean, I think it's kind of cool, but
yeah, I think it's hard to follow some of the things. It really does sound like something you could present like the whole meeting, because it seems like I'm opening the book now, like it looks like there is like a very point by point construction, right?
Yeah, it's very systematic. It's like it's a the whole framework that he develops.
But I remember seeing a lecture by Garcia on this, which I always thought was very amazing. There's also a really good interview with him and Badiou when Badiou had an interview program. It's online, like Counter. Forgot what the program was called. The program, no, the TV thing. But I remember it was a really good point that he made, very kind of analytic philosopher like, of saying like, we don't really know there is no real reference when we say we in politics these days, not in a kind of nostalgic kind of philosophical sense of what is the we, but in the actual sense, like you don't really know who you're referring to besides yourself, like, and that it's also very hard to make sure that when you say we, the others in that we, would you include you in them? Like, exactly this ungrounding of, the very referent of political speech. So I remember that was very kind of amazing. I don't remember like the construction within the book, but the way that he framed the problem seemed very interesting. So, I mean, I don't know if you would be up for presenting it. Like I didn't understand exactly how this transparency thing relates to the issue of trust and like those three things we were talking about, like how I probably just lost in your presentation of it, how it kind of solves it, or deals with it. But
yeah, I'll try to make the connection. And I would actually really love to do a work on a presentation about this, because I think it's really important. And I'm also sort of trying to work my way through like thinking about how it connects with the SDP framework. But yeah, I mean, I guess sort of what I'm thinking about is in terms of like how people trust different institutions or individuals or channels, right? Channels of information, I think has a lot to do with like the way that they're sort of, I guess you can talk about it as like a landscape and kind of MES way, the way that they prioritize, right? Like what groups they think of themselves as belonging to. That, it's not necessarily this thing of like, well, I trust this person or this channel and I don't trust this person or this channel, but maybe you trust multiple channels, but you have a sort of a sense of prioritization of like, I belong more to the group that this channel is sort of positioning itself as presenting to, or like I have a stronger sense of solidarity with this group or that group. I feel like this actually plays a really significant role in determining like what kind of things people will listen to or decide to actually trust, especially when there's a lot of uncertainty that like people tend to fall back onto like, but like, do these people get what I get? Do these people understand what I understand because of like who I am, where I am in the social world, what I'm belonging to? Does that make sense? Because that's sort of
yeah, I see what you mean. Like, so it's if I understand correctly, it's like the proposal is that we should think about being a collective that we are part of, like a we, in terms of a kind of a gradient of many inclusions, and which inclusions are prioritized or not have to do with like a weight that you put on these things based on other criteria than just being included, right? Like, right? Is that more like it? Like,
yeah, that's pretty much how I've been conceiving of it. It seems like that's basically the point that he's making. And there are a few different ways that he talks about it, but the transparency coefficient one was kind of like, it seemed really relevant to this. I mean, overall, he talks about it in terms of like a sort of stack of transparencies, which I think it helps to think about it in terms of that. And like with respect to information, like, this is all very kind of like informatic, like maybe amenable to like an information theory interpretation, because it's kind of like, the higher you prioritize the we, which the we is really just like a line of demarcation, right? Like it's not necessarily, you don't actually necessarily have a reference for it. You're just dividing up the world in some way that you're including yourself in it. But like, certain ones that are sort of closer to the top of the stack have like, less noise for you. This is actually sort of similar to like the idea of like landscape versus environment has to do with like the amount of noise, but the ones that are closer to the top of this stack have less noise to you. And the ones that are sort of farther down the stack, you might still think of yourself as included in that we, or like as a way to like divide the world to fit yourself somewhere within like the social space. But like the further down you go, the more opaque it becomes, the like, you know, the less transparent and the less intelligible it starts to be. And I think this has a really huge impact, not just on trust and on belief and on like what people interpret as truth, but even just the capacity to like understand or recognize truth or misinformation or whatever from someone else's position, or just sort of in general, you know.
But you know, like I wonder also, because if we go back to that idea, you know, like this, I think that this is actually more useful than I thought of it. Like when we were talking about the misalignment thesis, right, to this vulgarization principle. If we imagine this, right, that like misalignment, you can imagine something like this, right? You have different layers, and then you imagine that something here needs to correspond to something here, right? And misalignment would be something like this, where either things don't correspond anymore, or you need like very weird kind of ways of connecting things, right, under this layer. But the fact is that these layers are not all the same size. Like it's much more complicated or much more. So for example, communities can be very small. Bureaucratic systems tend to be a bit bigger, right? In terms of the amount of network and connections it takes to establish something like this. And productive circuits are actually much bigger themselves. So even if you have like a misalignment between them, right? So it goes like this. You can still kind of trust that it will fall on a similar kind of place, you know? So you would have good reason to trust this thing here. Like the logic of economic relations would be more stable due to the type of network that it establishes, and it's just more costly to change something institutionally, and it's the least costly to make and unmake personal relations, right? And why am I just mentioning this is because there is also a sense in which we only use the word we to talk about this layer here, right? I mean, we don't talk about we to name, like, what is the meaning of using the term like we to talk about the productive kind of space that connects us, you know, the production of rice in Brazil to the circuit of, consumption of it in India, coming back with the money to Brazil and employment. Like, with you, who is the we of that circuit? Like, there is no we, right? Like, not all forms of social logic revert back to something you would like be able to include yourself as a person inside, you know? Like, that's the first thing I wonder. I'm just saying this because I think it's a way to connect what you said with the topic that we were meant. I mean, of course, we're not going to go into it anymore, but, you know, this idea from our own text about socially mediated perspectives, where you can only kind of construct a we if you kind of almost remove yourself from it sometimes, right? Like, there are mediations in the world where they only become a perspective in the sense that it sees something about you that's relevant to you if you no longer are a referent to it as a person, right? This happens sometimes, like with science, for example. It concerns you, but one of the trade-offs is that in order to concern a world you're in, you need to kind of purify it of some personal traits, right? Politics can do that as well. Like, you can move to a level of description that will capture something true, but in the process, that mediation doesn't preserve you the way that you would recognize yourself, right? So, to the point that you wouldn't even talk about a we in any meaningful sense, perhaps. So that's one thing I wonder how that connects. And the second thing is that I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but the idea that, you know, we, like the idea of a collective you're part of, is just a way of parsing out the world. I find that that's a bit misleading, or not misleading, but again, there is a good kind of a counterexample of that with what Victor was talking about, or what we were talking about with this sort of fidelity dimension, which is meant to account for groups that only exist because you did something and not you do something because they exist, right? You know, like this weird way in which your actions are making the group consist. So you couldn't have you're actually building the referent more than anything. Again, it's a matter of composition, right? Like composing something that wasn't there. So I don't know how that would also fit into that frame.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of composition, though, you could arguably, like, maybe this is sort of, you know, reducing it a little bit, but you could argue that you say that you have a group of we's that are already part of your landscape, and then through whatever set of actions, it's a sort of recomposition of these existing things into something that, you know, then is not necessarily anticipated by that. You know, there's maybe an MES way to talk about like emergence or whatever. I wanted to say, though, that I think that maybe this would be best contextualized, like I was getting at before, with like, I've been really into that whole landscape environment world triad. I feel like that maybe is really helpful here, because like, I feel like this theory of we's that Garcia develops, you know, it's a little bit like the multi-layered transcendental worlds, except more like in the space of like landscape and environment, you know, where
I'm not sure I follow. Can you, it's a multi-layered thing at the level of landscapes. What?
Or like in landscapes and environments, because it's more about kind of like signal and noise rather than about, you know, the like sort of objective phenomenological relations in a structure. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Where it's like, what is, you know, important to, I guess, sort of these, and I mean, it's not just subjective actors, but it's sort of like normative frameworks. Like, you know, normativity sort of prioritizes certain things, right? And it reduces the world into a certain space where where there's some way to make sense of the information. I guess I'm still trying to get at this thing of like, on the one hand, you know, we can talk about the multi-layered transcendentals in this sort of objective dimension, but I'm also just trying to think about maybe this normative dimension where it's like the way that people divide up the social worlds isn't, you know, is obviously not the same as what the social worlds maybe would divide sort of themselves up to objects to each other. It's different when you have, you know, people engaging in these normative practices that I think can actually be analyzed with a similar kind of multi-layered framework. But I think the sort of the way Garcia approaches it might actually be helpful to, like, I don't know, sort of read them through each other a little bit better. And especially with this concept of information, I've been really obsessed with that Apolito scale problem and anarchism, cybernetic communism thing. I've been like, you know, taking some courses on information theory, and I've been trying to think about too, like the way that she talks about information, integrated information, I feel like might also potentially be helpful to talking about, like, you know, not just in terms of the existing kind of transcendental structures, but also in terms of like how people make sense of them in that like normative dimension.
I must be very honest with you. Like, I got a bit lost because I think like it would be good to kind of, again, if you were to present on Tristan Garcia's book and like spell out a bit more the connection with MES and with Apolito, like I can't really see how the things fit together. I see that you're going somewhere, but I have a hard time, like what I got from it, like, just correct me if I'm wrong, like that you're trying to find a way to facilitate the connection between, for example, this talk of, as you said, like when we talk about social worlds, it looks like very objective, doesn't say very much about how people normatively like act, right? And we need a mediating theory, like a theory to bind the two things together. That's why you said it's like more the environment and the landscapes, which in the MES framework meant like the internal model you have of how to interpret the world, and also the environment in which you can check things, right? Like, would you then say, if that's correct, would you then say that this makes sense? Where is it? Here. Would you then say that trust concerns like a landscape, like how you come up with a model of the world that you, based on your beliefs of how the world is? Validity concerns environments because that's like the part of the world where you can actually check things, because you can actually engage and see how things react. And then fidelity concerns the world because it's the part that you don't access, but you don't need to get to it because you are in it, right? Like you don't verify worlds. Exactly as I think Vitor said it very nicely here, like you just change reality. Like worlds is something you change, not something you verify. You can verify things in your environment, right? And trust
it makes
landscape.
so much sense. It makes a lot of sense. That definitely helps, I think, a lot.
I'm always so paranoid when we say like we bind like a lot of stuff into a simpler thing. Like, can this be real?
No, I mean, I think it works. I think it's a really great place to start to talk about it. Because yeah, I mean, it definitely from how we're talking about it now, it makes sense. I mean, if we pursue it more, maybe we'll find problems. But I think it's a really great sort of strand to keep figuring out.
And I mean, it makes perfect sense that there is like a profound Kantian idea behind this new pragmatic idea that you only have validity and trust, right? Beliefs and knowledge. Because you are always, let's say, you're always in this model kind of oscillating between statements you can check because they're accessible through scientific means or good reasoning and so on, and your internal model, right? So partial externality and internal inference, right? Structures. So that's like, this part here is like the in itself. You just approach it infinitely by making better models and verifying things better, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, and I think how you get beyond this pseudo-Hegelian but ultimately Kantian idea, which is the Marxist holy grail for this new pragmatism, is that I feel like people in the more Marxist tradition and kind of a different Hegelian approach just say you don't need to get to the in itself because you are in the in itself. So what you should do is you should change it. Like that's how you know that you know something which is beyond knowledge. You just change the thing. If you can change something which is beyond knowledge, then you're in it, right? You don't need to get to it, right? Which is pretty much where like Marxists and Hegelian put truth here and knowledge here, right? Yeah, and if you can't change it, you're missing the point. Really good. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. This is a good way of perhaps of framing it, and I guess that right. And it also makes sense that the more the world becomes complex, and we don't know how to kind of regard transformation, the more it seems like we're constantly moving between this and this. Like, yeah, you need better trust relations behind knowledge. Validity becomes relative, so you need. It's a problem of trust, and you're kind of moving between these two things all the time, you know?
Does it make sense to interpret it in topological terms as trust being about is a sort of interior of a space, of a set of, yeah, validity being the border and the world some sort of like closure?
Yeah, I think that it has a lot to do with how we frame this. Last time we were talking about Dennis's presentation, we did something like this where you could have like a world, then let's say you have a system here. Inside the system, you have the landscape, which is how it maps the world, right? And the part of the world that it gets to directly exchange with, right? This is the environment. So it is kind of the border, right, between the world and the system. Right, so you would say like landscape has to do with this. Environment is that's part of the, because for example, of everything that goes on in a world, not everything is an input to the system, right? The environment is made up of the part of the world that are an input to the system. So for example, let's say the system is a person who is like a person who's just concerned with buying groceries or like just their economic life. You know, there's this huge machinery of things that have to go on so that they can go into the market and see the price of rice. So the price of rice is a signal inside their environment. The network of inputs and outputs that make up the price of rice, they cannot directly access, they cannot verify or validate statements about, if it has anything to do with political decisions by the Chinese government, right? So you get this realm here to be the environment, which is a set of inputs that actually go into and outputs that go into the system. You have the landscape, which you might even fill with like conspiracy theories about the Chinese world that actually, let's say, would explain this, right? And like in your landscape will go like the things you think that happen when you do things for climate change, like recycling. When I do this, like all these other circuits should happen, right? It's just in your head. You don't have an environment in which you could go and check those things, right? And the actual world concerns all the inputs and outputs inside the system and inside the environment of the system. So it's a much broader thing. So you can, and then in this you can have a cool distinction, because you can share a world but not share an environment, and you can share an environment and not share a landscape, and you can also share landscapes but not share anything else, right? Like you can establish connections of trust or some type of connection where you build common visions of the world to decide how to act and react, but your environments are actually different. Or you can actually share, even though you have different landscapes, you have similar environments because you get to interact with the same inputs and outputs in the world, Or you can actually share a world, but not share environments. For example, climate change is all about this. Capitalist destruction affects every local environment, but you don't really see the points of connections between those environments directly, right? They're mediated by something that looks like an opaque part of the world. Does any of this make sense, or does this all sound totally crazy?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think the only thing is like practically the world doesn't ever reveal itself, right? The world is just this like.
Yeah, but the world doesn't need to. That's where Badiou would answer. But the world doesn't need to reveal itself to you. It reveals itself. It's just not to you, right? And I mean, and then we can even frame our own point right here, because the whole point of the socially mediated thesis is that you need to build a system and an environment adequate to the things you want to see, right? There is nothing hidden for the proper system and proper environment, right? You would say, but this is hidden here, this arrow is part of the world, but I'm a content subject to it. I get to see these phenomena, but this arrow I'd never see. You say, yeah, but that's the wrong system for this thing to appear, right? If rather than a buyer in the market, right, buying rice, you were a nation negotiating the price of rice with China, then this would appear. So nothing is hidden. It's just that nothing is hidden, but it's not true that everything is presented to everyone, right? Yeah, exactly. We need to raise there's no like class consciousness is the consciousness of class. It's not how about that turn of phrase? Class consciousness is more like building a big monster that has consciousness, not being conscious of a monster. Yeah, man. I mean, this is like one day we want to make him into a commie. He already dresses like one, from what I've seen. So, I mean, all these distinctions would be mobile, right? But it's interesting that it actually maps very nicely to this. So, if you believe a sort of underlying kind of reformist idea that better landscapes, better treatment of environments, perhaps it expands a bit, you know, treats new problems, and you kind of go with this, you only need trust and validity, right? You add this kind of, the point with this here, like you could even say like there's a little step, right? Like validity, if you take it like as a basic epistemology, it's faulty, because if you didn't have like a model that you trust and share, like just taking the example of science, right? Like the Latourian critique would be, you guys pretend like validity validation comes from, or objectivity comes from like being itself. It doesn't. Like you are actually relying on a bunch of things. For example, you're relying on networks of agreement and trust, which are much more hybrid and porous and so on. And then he will say, okay, we moved from, you know, this transcendental frame to an open frame that now recognizes like the multi-agent hybrid world. And then what Badiou is saying is that you actually need a third thing, because you cannot account for like serious transformation just by bringing into play the presuppositions you trust, the beliefs you trust. You need to also include, you know, this weird way in which you are part, like this whole thing is part of this bigger thing, right? Badiou is a bit like the Zizek'ian idea that you don't change the world by creating an arrow that goes from here to here. That's like a Kantian misunderstanding. You do the Hegelian thing, which is when you change this, since this whole thing is already inside the world, you've changed the world, right? That's why Badiou says that in politics, there is no other. It's not like we are this group here with this environment and we want to change some lost soul here. If you change this, you are in the same world as everyone else, right? That's why.
If you think, for example, these actions of throwing stuff at paintings, it's like playing with the trust of institutions. You know,
Yeah, it's
like,
a really good point.
Art is sacred, but why isn't Earth sacred? It's like you create a cognitive, because the problem of climate change is a bit cognitive, right? You can't see so you will go ahead and destroy a painting. Okay, the $60 million destroyed. Not really, but so how would you feel if your world was being destroyed? That's what it's like. So by political action, you create a form of knowledge or truth, or a way.
Yeah, I really think that there's something to it. I mean, also, I think that's also, I mean, I was very, I changed my mind about that group of people many times. Now I'm sympathetic to them just because of, I really think that it's a very vulgar thing, but it's for that very reason, I agree with your assessment. The part that I even when we were talking about it, I realized the other day when you were here, that I just think that they didn't realize that the network of trust in Europe is not the same as everywhere else. So like in Brazil, a lot of people I saw who were appalled by it, they couldn't like make the movement from they couldn't even make the reasoning in their minds of well, they didn't destroy the painting, or what was the argument that, you know, it has something to do with the institution of art, because they don't know anything about art. They just know that one Van Gogh kind of represents art as such. Then they were so kind of, they had to be shocked because it's crucial to who they are that art should not be messed with. Do you know, Anna, the activists from Just Stop Oil who threw the tomato soup against the Van Gogh, then they were called eco-fascists, and people hated on them a lot, and then they were, yeah. Did you see this? I'm really glad if you didn't, because you would be the first person who didn't. Oh my God, that's amazing. Yeah, there was this big thing. I mean, if you just read what Victor sent you, I was just gonna write like something else here while we are, yeah, to do something here. So, yeah.
Do you think you can project this on our other super diagram, the one on social mediations? Like, would it make sense to say that the landscape is the agent plus the mediation, and the environment is the mediation plus the world, and the
I have the impression.
fidelity is like the college or something? Because I mean, I'm still trying to understand, but the trust and or the landscape is more related to the sort of like immediate internal composition, like the internal composition plus some interface,
Yeah,
right,
I
of the
mean,
agent.
yeah, to this, if I'm I don't think I have it here. This little model here, actually there shouldn't be an arrow here. But this little idea here is a simplification of something Dennis presented, like from the memory evolutive systems, right? And once you develop the memory evolutive systems far enough, you get into this distinction between memory and landscape, which is a landscape is an internal part to a system that stores. It's pretty much like the predictive modeling, like very basic kind of for actions and reactions, right? So I could open the book here, but it comes from that kind of idea, right? So you would have like a memory that feeds into the landscape, and you can anticipate a future landscape, which then tells you what might happen, and you see the error. But it's pretty much an internal thing to a system that is helping you recharacterize the parameters through which you engage and receive information from the world. But it's like the most minimal version of it that they can come up with, right? So they make that distinction between some subset of the internal part of a system will be called a landscape. It's not an external part of the system, it's internal. Then there is the notion of environment, which concerns the set of other entities and so on that you engage with directly and that you become composed with, or you leave things to that space and so on. And they only work with these two concepts, environment and the landscape inside the system, right? Whereas we are trying to, we asked ourselves, okay, well, where would Badiou's world come in? And we said, well, it looks like a good place to put it would be those sets of inputs and outputs and possible relations that don't compose directly or don't necessarily compose. So a higher thing, right? The environment would be a subset of the world. So you can have something like a huge world. You have like a system here, and a system here, and you would say like there is some shared environment between these two, and perhaps there is no shared environment between this one and this, right? But still, you would say that the three of them are part of the same world.
So I mean, it does fit a bit with the social mediation diagram, right?
Yeah, the place where I would be, where I was even telling Dennis, I'm not sure if he already left, but I was telling Dennis that I think we're not there yet formally, is that, you know, when you look at this diagram, it has, right, individuals acting and reacting with mediations that act and react with the world, and or you can also go directly from how individuals act and react with the world. But there is a fundamental problem with this picture from the, like, it doesn't fit the memory evolutive systems in one point, which is that these arrows don't make sense, right? I mean, individuals can only act and react on other individuals. Like, what does it mean for an individual to act on an institution? It means to act on things an individual can relate to, right? Socially speaking. Unless you think like you stop the other possibility would be to say, you know, if you act on many people at once, but then only throwing bombs and burning bridges would be social action. So by the whole point of the memory evolutive systems is to give an account of how, like, starting only with individuals, you get to groups due to how the individuals relate to each other, right? Right. You want to say like, these groups here have some relations with regards to this. They have a collective link. This means that you can treat them as a set, like as a thing that has an interior, right? So the problem with translating one thing to another is that the memory evolutive systems perspective kind of bars this diagram from being this simple, because the move from this to this is not like a path, right? It's a path from the level of scales. Like, what you're actually doing is something like this. You're saying these individuals interact, right, in some way that makes them, you can count them as a mediation. So this is interaction, reaction, and so on. And somehow this allows you to move up a scale, right? And then mediations, sorry, there's also an individual who is a no. Yeah, so sometimes you need to look at one individual to see the mediation. And sometimes there is no particular individual, just the dynamic itself, right? There are many ways of moving from relations of individuals to relations between, like, to a mediation. And then you can have like multiple mediations, and the relation between the mediations themselves, right, forms a larger mediation. And so you go. So the way that memory evolutive systems bring environments in, and like this whole nomenclature, this whole vocabulary of environments, landscapes, and so on, it's meant to describe a process that is internal to one of these layers, like, and slowly you move up the scales, right? So there is some work to do so that we can explain, like, to make this logic consistent with the memory evolutive thing. But if we skip that like formal problem for now, we kind of have an intuition of what we mean, right? Like when we say, yeah, I totally agree with Victor. Like, for example, it's definitely true that there is something people were seeing, almost like a vibe, right? We only knew how to act together as a kind of army, an online army in Lula's election by looking at Giannoni's. Like, if you just made a smaller cell of, you know, people with their cell phones, they didn't know what to do. They only knew what to do as a collective by looking at one person. It's like a very simple form of hierarchy, right? But it is true that by acting through Giannoni's, we act on the political scenario in a way that's totally different than what would be accessible if we directly acted on the world. We were also answering to things that were happening to that collective and to Giannoni's himself that wouldn't be happening to us outside of him, right? In a way. So you could, but like, to go back to your question, Hansel, how would we localize these things, right? There is, in some sense, in my head, I would claim that for us, yeah, I think it would be wrong to say this, but in some sense, you might want to say something like in landscape, environment, and fidelity. Landscape, because this is the collective existing internal to like the collective as it only cognitively exists, seems to be like the model I have of the world in my head, right? The things I get to interact in the social world come through mediations, and that part of the social world I cannot interact with as an object, but only because I'm part of it, right? It's the ecology. Like, I don't interact, if you cannot interact with this is a really good, actually a really good insight. Like, you cannot interact with a political movement as an object, because if you recognize the political movement to exist, you're already part of it, right? It's like you cannot interact with your love relation as an object, because if you're saying there is love, you're already part of it. If you were to say, like, I'm gonna manipulate my romantic relationship, then it's not a romantic relationship. If you are, you're already outside of it. Exactly. So I would say, like, I would probably, if you were to be like a bit quick with it, I would put fidelity here, validity here, and landscape here. But the problem is that to make this properly consistent, right, there should be the three of them for each of them, right? Right, there should be a landscape at the level of individuals, but a landscape at the level of collectives. I remember John made a really good point. We were using the example of a police station, right? And my idea was, like, I don't want landscapes to look like they are mental models, because if I think of a police department or a police station as a system, you could claim that, like, even like the place where they teach policemen how to act is a bit like the model or the landscape of the police station as a system, right? Or the police force as a system. It's not necessarily like a mental thing. It can be like a surrogate landscape. It exists in the pieces of paper, documents, judicial cases that were already approved, even if the policemen themselves have a different model in their heads, right? So it would be interesting not to equate landscapes in the sense of the structures of trust that create beliefs, that model behavior normatively and so on, with something which is necessarily cognitive at the level of individuals, because we want to keep to the scale relative theory where this can happen at different scales, right? So this little model here, with the environment here, and the world being this thing that at first looks like what's beyond, right, the environment, but actually comes back as the thing you change when you change, both the system and the environment. Like, this should be able to be scaled up both to individuals and to environments and to mediations, I think, right? So you could say, like, in the level of individuals, this is mostly a cognitive thing. This is mostly, a small kind of space beyond your, like, individual practices, your body, and so on, in a very small environment. But then you can have like a larger system, which is like a institution. And then this landscape actually might be more concrete and more kind of out there in the world than in your head, in some meaningful sense. And then the environment also changes, right? So that's all to say, I don't know how we're going to bridge that. Like, I think it's an open problem. I think it's a formal problem as well. Like, I think there's conceptual tweaking, but ultimately we'll need to make sure things actually, there's a way of matching these things up,
One thing I think is interesting, kind of in light of that idea about not being in the head so much, is I really feel like we're demonstrating a lot of different ways Peirce's basic idea that, like, to really deal with abstraction, you always have to have like a 3-term system, because like the environment idea and like really splitting things into world, environment, and landscape, like, seems to somehow give like a conceptual flexibility and mobility or something to like really like show that, because this relates back to the comment I made in the chat about like early Marxism. Like there's something about dualism, and you see this in like Lenin's theory of consciousness and a lot of early consciousness raising theories, that like dualism somehow enforces ideas as landscape as just cognitive models. You end up getting these kind of like back and forths between the world and each individual, or maybe like at most like a kind of group think idea of representing the world. But when you introduce something as a third term like environment, it almost helps give the conceptual space to then think about things like a police station as a whole as a landscape, or like the theory of the collective worker from the primer, which even though it's built on like quote canonical Marxism, is a different, it's an addition, I think, in a lot of ways to Marxist theory. And again, that comes out of another aspect of tripartite thinking, because I think that came out of the original composition, interaction, and intelligibility.
Yeah, the amount of things in trees we have is crazy.
Like we've had multiple triads at this point come out in this work, and each time they seem to give a way to avoid the individualization of abstraction. So of the many thinkers we connect to, we also can now say that we're helping validate Peirce's basic ideas. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I like that too. I mean, and there's also something we didn't say with this model, like as if things are not complex enough. The other problem we have in hands, which are formal problems that have to do exactly with this connection between MES system, which we can take this kind of like the memory evolutive systems. It has two logics we need to work into our project. The one is this movement of, you have things that function as atoms that relate to one another. And then this allows you, for example, we have Janones here. Let's put the J for Janones in his homage. And like people everyone has a relation to him. This means that you can see everyone's relation amongst each other by looking at their relations to one person. So this forms what we sought to be called a cone, right? And this allows us to by treating the logic of Janones, now we can treat the logic at a different scale. I'm simplifying, but it's kind of like that. So there is this kind of complex hierarchical logic of how you move from individuals to mediations through this diagrammatic graph-like theory, right? So that's the first point, which is how to introduce like complex hierarchy with move from individuals to mediations, and to mediations perhaps to worlds, which is something we don't know how to do. But then there's a second problem, which makes it well, then there's three problems actually. Then there's a second thing, which is what we were just seeing, which is memory evolutive systems bring into play this idea that you have landscapes inside of systems, then you have environments, right? And then you have we are introducing, we want to make some addition of worlds to this, and we want to see how this plays in. But then in our particular case, there is a complication, which is it's not enough to draw things like this. This is a nice system, this is an environment, and then this is like a larger world. Because for us, like since the world has many layers, right? Like this, actually, that's not a good image, but in any case, let's say that the world has many layers. This is layer A, this is layer B, and this is layer C. What we claim is that, okay, this is very, very rich in different ways of connecting, because it comes from all these different layers and how they interconnect. But let's say this system is only made of, individuals who get together to play, I refuse to say soccer, so they play football on the weekends. They don't have any sort of financial transactions. They live very close to each other, so there's no bus fares. They play in a public park and nothing changes in terms of, perturbations to the public status of that park. Like they only get to interact with things that come from layer A, because they never do anything that perturbs, these other layers. So this is an environment, we would say, like only on one layer, whereas things at the institutional level and at the productive level remain part of the world, but don't form part of the environment, right? So depending on how a system is constituted and composed. So for example, now we want to play against teams from everywhere in the country. So we need to solve problems of how we're going to finance the championship. Well, all of a sudden, this environment is no longer just A, it's also C. Or we want to play in a place that has no court. So we're going to, plea for the government to construct a football field where there wasn't one. Suddenly, mode B also comes into play. And once the government doesn't give us the field that we want, we're going to burn the prefeitura and run the city ourselves. Well, then, they start getting like very political all of a sudden. So you have variations where, depending on how the system is composed, the environment will catch on to more and more things of the world or less things, not only in the sense of how many inputs and outputs, but also the quality of the inputs. So this kind of logical depth of the problem of systems, environments, and worlds, this is not something that is very easy to bridge with the MES system, right? This is our own crazy thing, saying that depending on how this is composed, it changes what type of environment you can get, right? This is where the whole thing that John was presented in terms of type theory connecting with all of this. This is what's at stake, right? Depending on how you compose this, the type of input will change. And the world is kind of like a reservoir of types, right? So yeah, there's that problem as well.
Drawing got really, really
very simple, right? Looks totally crazy, man. I wonder if there are better things here. We can discover it with this.
I think there's a problem of peripherization and vulgarization that is a consequence, right? That this model needs to take it into account. It takes it into account, but I think we need to think it more through. We need to think it with more care.
Yeah.
How, for example, this whole Janones thing, how does a mother who depended do auxílio emergencial em 2020, now depends on Auxílio Brasil, and now is threatened with the end of the auxílio, and Lula may or may not give the auxílio, relates to Janonismo, and the left that depended on Janones to get an electoral victory. Now Janones is not that necessary anymore because we won. And I think that kind of thing would be crucial to understand the political developments in Brazil. Because
yeah, let's try that. Let's try creating that, because I think you give a really good example. Because I think that, to summarize one thing that we were talking very early on today that has to do with what you said, and we could use this model to talk about it, is what's the difference, right, between Janones' actions for auxílio emergencial and Janones' actions as the guru of social network in Lula's campaign, right? I would say something like this. Let's say this is the mother, right? She's getting, and there's a space where she can act, right? And I have the impression that early on, what Janones did was, in his network, was more so, and here was,
expanded the word of the mothers. He
yeah,
connected
the
mothers
environment
to
of
each
the
other.
mother got bigger, right? His environment shared with the mother like this.
He was like a meeting point.
Yes,
Not
exactly.
a spokesperson.
Yeah, so but it was the environment that got bigger. Like she cannot, by her actions and reactions, touch on the issue of, will the emergency income continue or not. There is some environment that he also has some power to interact with, where this exists, right? This is, let's say, this some state part here, right? And he made a connection between her environment and this,
that's
right?
precise.
Yeah, this is Janones, old school Janones, the old Janones, right? The new Janones, I think it's more like this. This is not here. And you need to add the landscape. Now, you need to imagine that there is a landscape here, then a landscape to someone else here. Sorry. Right? The environments are still separate, probably. But I feel like this is what he's acting on, right? That these two things are more synced now.
Wait, why you're saying that the mothers were more heterogeneous in some sense?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, like, it seems to me that there is a distinction between kind of allowing the environment to expand its reach. Like I can have more effects through Janones. If I go to Janones' lives and I say my problems, he can actually go there and actually read out my name in the list of people who are might not receive or haven't managed to register for the income.
And
right?
people would like use Janones lives to publish WhatsApp groups, so people would enter in the groups and they could organize, because Janones has many viewers and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so that's my point. Like, it looks like it has something to do with the environment, but it doesn't require you to have the same beliefs, right? You will, of course, you have to update your trust in many ways because you're engaging with all these things. I'm just thinking that the thing we were talking about before, where we're circulating information through our own bubbles, but we're all circulating the same information, right? Nobody was suddenly going to groups they were never part of. Janones was all about, yeah, share this information in your networks, right? So the thing that was actually promoted was a similar view of what the right was doing. So the right was actually fighting in terms of, no, you can trust us, not Janones, about what the right is.
It reminds a bit the inversion of like when some organization which initially functions as a space, as a means for new connections being made, like sort of like bottom up account. There's at some point there's an inversion in which the organizational scheme sort of like, instead of extracting some sort of synergy from these local centers that were disconnected, it sort of starts to inform and simplify, like, you know, the local nodes, right? In terms of direct to there's the same information. So say a command, everyone do that. It's the same information coming from the central node, which is Janones, being replied and sort of spreading. The opposite music, the inverse of that, you have, because it's local nodes that are initially unconnected, they are not initially, they're not consistent, right? So you can extract more from that because they're varied. in the opposite sense, you
Mhm.
cannot get new information, I think.
Yeah,
because you-
but like I just don't want it to look like one is better than the other. It just looks like they're different
Sure, yeah,
moments, right? Because sometimes you need to clean the channel, right? Like this is
but
actually
it
part of
sounds- it sounds
Latour's
a bit
art.
of
Yeah,
the
sorry, yeah.
local, global. No, just it sounds a bit of the two ways to interpret the
Ah,
local versus global thing,
fuck.
like more conciliatory mode
Yeah.
and a more compositional conflictual mode.
Shit. Yeah, that's, I mean, as if we didn't have enough crazy material to investigate, but it does have that bit of that sound.
Yeah, but we have the presentation on November 10th, November 7th. Next week.
Next week, we're, man, it's almost like we did this on purpose.
Which presentation we have?
I'll do it
Who's
about
presenting?
the.
Vitor is presenting on auxílio emergencial.
Ah, awesome, great.
The logic of Janons, yeah. We even call him Steve Janons. The Bannon of the left. I knew Vitor would love this. But I like that there is, I feel like there is, I know Anna is always concerned with this, like, which I also think Caron is very concerned with this. Like when we go too much into this mediation and the organization is a perspective, it looks like it's not clear how this can be navigated by people, right? And I think that this connection between, you know, there are new things you can verify that have to do a bit with intelligibility. The world is more intelligible because you're organized. It's good to see that validity, intelligibility, it does have something to do with, you know, an environment in a certain sense, like things you can actually type in terms of inputs, outputs, you can name these things, right? And that there is a counterpart to this, which seems to be slightly decoupled, like the landscape, the model, or the way you picture this, and you try to anticipate effects, the things you believe about it. You can actually think the two things together in terms of trust and this kind of networks. In our particular case, I think that you can actually complexify this because though I really want to hear what Anna has to say about Garcia's idea of we and how these weights of priority are developed, like one challenge we kind of would surely pose to this, and we would need to see how it goes, is that it's not only that there are different degrees of trust you can have on the different collectives you're part of, but there's actually different types of trust, right? For example, the way I trust somebody else to be also a Flamenguista like me is not the same way I trust somebody to accept the money I carry in my pocket, right? Like when you trust somebody to be from the same group as you are, in terms of like the team you cheer for, there is something directly that you have with that person. When you trust somebody to accept money you carry in your pocket, it's actually a totally indirect relation where I trust that when that person believes that when they come to use the paper with a third party, the third party will accept. If I believe they believe this, I will still use the money, right? It's very interesting to take like a piece of money and rip it a bit and see at which point you think if you rip it more, it's no longer money. And it's usually the point that's not for you. It's the point for the person who will get it from you, that they believe that a third party would not accept from them the money. Like if they think they can pass it along after you, they will accept it from you, right? So every mode also has a different quality of what kind of this reliance means. So what does it mean to have a more complex notion of this, you know? when you build like a landscape of kind of a mental model or kind of representation of how causation happens in social worlds. Perhaps that's also why people tend to reduce it all to one type, right? It's always money, it's always power. Perhaps it's also to make it treatable.
I mean, I think one thing you can say here, actually, in the spirit of the whole objective phenomenology and the primer and everything, is like, on the one hand, you can say that you have we's with like people, but is it possible to have we's with like commodities? Does that make sense to try to talk about it in those terms?
What would a we with a commodity mean, though?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I guess part of the thing here is like to just get a better definition of like how exactly Garcia uses the word, because he develops these sort of very specific definitions, but I think I would need to put them more effectively in like the systematic context that he develops them, because it's like, I agree with you that, you know, I mean, one of the problems with this kind of approach, if you're looking at everything in terms of like group belonging, is you miss that role of mediation to some extent, right? That like, you know, it can be really hard to talk about situations where the compositionality depends on things that really aren't legible to you in terms of group identity or whatever.
Yeah, I also think that there is something, I mean, I find this very interesting, and I don't want to say too much with that before you have a chance to also present more. But it's something that I've been, especially by learning more from Caron and the way that he deals with philosophy of language and some of its issues. Like I more and more feel like Dennis as well, the way he and John presented on type theory and how these things are, it's becoming more clear we can connect this. Like we don't do this, but we could kind of at this point make quite fine-grained analysis of how political language is structured, how concepts are built, and actually by the assumption that these have reference to whoever are speaking that way, right? That actually learn something about how these environments are composed. So that we could actually have like a novel take on discourse theory or something like that. At the same time that I've personally have been convinced that this is more useful than I thought. On the other hand, there's a lot of ideas that kickstart from that problem. Like, you know, you start from the word, and like especially philosophy has a hard time not doing that, right? Like it's our go-to structure. Like, look at the word we, what does it mean? And then you start going into the meaning of it and you discover this whole bunch of problems, right? But I have the impression that in politics, part of the big difficulty we have in the modern world is that most of the things that we have socially in common, they cannot be put in a sentence which has the referent of a we. And every time we try to do that, we necessarily go into a level of abstraction, right? So like, if you want to be concrete about the collective, productive collectives, a large-scale productive collectives, you won't say we. You will say something weirdly objective about, I don't know why today rice is my example. I think I'm getting hungry, like about rice, right? Fluctuations in the price of rice actually are a way of talking about the producers of rice and the interest in rice and a bunch of things. And if you were to say we in that context, you would be actually going to an abstraction with no reference. So you either objectify to the point that you disappear, but then you have a real common collective referent, or you create a we, which is a subject, but then it has no real referent. And there's a weird imbalance in that appears in many places, you know, in, I think, contemporary politics, and it can get diffused or a bit kind of, the problem can disappear a bit if you sometimes start from the word, like we need a better we, like a new sense of we, but perhaps it doesn't even take that linguistical form. But again, as I said, like I just sound, you know, stupid because I have no idea what this guy wrote. So it makes no sense to say this thing of a book I didn't read. But it's the sort of thing that I think it's interesting to. It's a big problem, and I think it justifies why this issue of mediation sometimes requires, better than why perspective sometimes is a better starting point than position of enunciation. When you take the position of enunciation and the words and if they refer to you, how they implicate you, sometimes you're required to assume more than political organization would allow you to, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are definitely important questions. I mean, I almost wonder, like, I'm still very much at the starting point of wrapping my head around category theory, but I wonder if, like, especially with memory evaluative systems, I feel like there might be some formalisms that could potentially be relevant to breaking down like what Garcia is talking about within the context of like his larger framework when he's talking about this concept of we. Like, I think it's hard in a way when you're trying to like somehow formalize subjective experience or whatever, but at the same time I feel like that's some of the best resources to develop those sorts of things might come from that, or maybe some of the IIT stuff might be interesting to follow up with. But I'll definitely work on a presentation and try to like get everything together to like make more sense of it. And if I have any intuitions there, I'll definitely include them in the presentation.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Yeah, Renz, it's later for you now, man. Like is it 1 hour later or 1 hour earlier?
No, it got better.
Oh, thank God, man.
It's just 4 hours now. Yeah.
Just 4 hours.
Now.
Shit.
Just 1 o'clock. Yeah, it's much better.
I mean, indirectly, we ended up discussing the text as we were meant to, or we planned to. But I mean, I think after Vitor's presentation next week, we can plan to actually get through. I mean, I forgot that section 3 was like ridiculously long. I mean, we didn't even go to the text today, but if we did and try to actually go through point by point, probably we would be like stuck with it forever. So it's probably a good idea. I wonder, like, yeah, right. I mean, sure. It's just a case. I mean, I think we ended up raising a bunch of issues that if we were to publish it as a longer piece, like these issues we were talking about earlier about bringing trust, like bringing this MAS stuff in might be already a lot of stuff to expand if we wanted. I don't know. That part of
I think any specific piece would be more effective, because this problem of confusing communication with the organization, I think it is something that will get people pissed off, and at the same time they will recognize that it is an issue. That how do we know when we're just texting and tweeting and posting what are we doing to change reality? I think it is a problem for most people, and I think thinking about that in the terms that we put in this discussion would be interesting for a lot of people.
I'm adding this to the text here. So a good problem to focus on would be distinguishing. I mean, we try to do this a bit, but very subtly in the text, distinguishing with examples between communication and organization. Like so we can talk about this thing like trust, validity, fidelity, etc. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it might be good to go through. I mean, because we had two objectives, right? Like one was to make sure everyone is on the same page as far as possible with these ideas of the text, and the other is to add stuff we don't know yet but we think we should know before we publish it as like a little book or something. I feel like we added a bunch of stuff today and had a lot of good ideas we can come back to, but it would be nice to make sure that, you know, section 3, which is such an important part of the text, makes sense. So I would say, like, before we move on with the text, we probably should just have a meeting where everyone agrees to read section 3 and we just like debate it a bit to make sure we are all on the same page on it, because it's a crucial one for a lot of stuff we're going to do later. And I know Dennis is working on connecting it to the memory evolutive system formalism. So to make that, it will be easier to make that connection. And also because if we're serious about what we've been saying, everyone who's here who's interested in this can participate in turning this text into like a book. We'll probably have, at some point, we'll have to share like parts of the text, like who wants to expand this bit, who wants to expand that bit, you know? So making sure we all have like a basic agreement on how to deal with these ideas will facilitate that part if we ever get to it, you know?
That makes sense. I just wanted to say really fast that, you know, I mentioned on the Zula, but I've been reading the new Karatani book, which is really crazy. And I still have a lot more to get through, and it's I'm like trying to work with the Japanese text. But what's really interesting is that he tends now, from what I've read so far of the sections about Modi, he tends to define it increasingly in terms of like a mode of exchange that is like situated within nature as a whole, in a way where it's like the sort of holistic, like instead of it being kind of like a mode of exchange between individual people, it's like the mode of exchange like of intercourse. He uses the word intercourse more, the Japanese translation of the German, to talk about like intercourse with nature or with the world, sort of beyond just the reduced social space, which I feel like is really interesting and maybe can connect like you know, well, in a certain sense, to a lot of the work we're doing. So I'm going to keep on going in that connection. It adds a whole other layer.
And I'm so jealous. Yeah, you know what we should do? Like, would be a big, like, we could do like a kind of live translation of sections of the book. We just do like a live, and it's you with the book, and you just like read a page, and then say, well, this page says something like this, and then you read another page, and we just do like the whole book with that.
What I can try to actually do too is like just sort of write up a summary of some of the key things and some of the key ideas that I'm trying to get through, and maybe go over also some of the ambiguities, because a lot of the translation is like, I mean, I can figure out a lot of it, but a lot of it is still very unclear to me. So like I'm definitely making some leaps, but if I talk about like, you know, maybe my uncertainties about this or that thing, I think that also could potentially help with the discussion. So no, I think it's an interesting idea. I'll definitely figure out some way to approach it, because I think it's
Can you imagine like the amount of people, if we said like we're gonna do a live, Anna's gonna do a live kind of translation of parts of this untranslated book by Karatani in our channel, like thousands of people, Anna would rush to hear the word. So no, but definitely I'm just ridiculously curious. No, well, okay then. So should we wrap it up then?
Sounds good.
Okay, guys.
Sounds good. So I'll talk to Leticia. Maybe I can beg her for a copy of the book for a few members of the STP. Gabriel, would you like one?
No, I would. I mean, yeah, I would love to. I was gonna buy it anyway, but I wonder, like, if one thing you could ask her, if she has a text in English we could share with everyone from one of her publications that she thinks
she has.
Yeah, she has a lot of things in English, right? So
yeah.
yeah, just so people can also get, because Letícia is this Brazilian anthropologist and cybernetician who writes a lot of really good things writes even with Vitor as well on contemporary politics, and her work is really, really interesting, and Vitor has a good contact with her, so we could definitely invite her over and see if she would like to talk to us a bit. I think she would be like an amazing kind of person to invite.
And she
That's
talks a
exciting.
lot about that stuff of truth, lies, and I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, the regime of truth, like truth in like social networking and like contemporary politics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's really good on that. Okay, guys.
Good night. Very
Good
good
night.
discussion.
It was really cool. See you guys. Bye-bye.
É nóis.
É nóis.